welcome all of you to the second day of this wonderful conference celebrating the 25th anniversary of the passage of the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which, as we learned yesterday, is a model for the world. I'm Helen Nienhauser, and I'm Vice Chair of the Alaska Conservation Foundation Board of Trustees. Yesterday was an extremely inspiring day for all of us, I'm sure. It certainly was for me. The session on the Anilka story brought back many memories, and I decided that perhaps the most appropriate thing for me to spend a few moments on this morning is to share some of those memories with you, because they help supply some of the context for what was happening in Alaska at that time. I was here for all of it. I came to Alaska in 1959, right after statehood. I came from northern New Jersey, already in love with Alaska and determined to do whatever I could to make sure Alaska never looked like New Jersey. By the late 1960s, when the first stirrings of the conservation movement began in Alaska, but began in Anchorage, it was already well underway in Fairbanks, I had homesteaded in Eagle River and I had 2 children, which eventually brought me into Anchorage to live. I was one of the founders of the Alaska Center for the Environment in 1971 and became one of the 5 volunteer coordinators who kept the doors open for a number of those early years. We saw our role as being a place where you could actually find a conservationist, hard to do in those days, and as coordinator and facilitator of the existing conservation groups. In that capacity, I remember hosting some of the meetings of the Maps on the Floor Society, which we heard about yesterday. Mark Hickok, Walt Parker, Will Troyer, and the others in that group were my mentors as I began to learn about those magnificent wild places beyond Anchorage and the Chugach. We were also charter members of the new Sierra Club chapter, and I remember one clear summer day getting to fly with Jack Hessian in a small plane over the Wrangles all day over that magnificent scenery and no potty breaks. I organized some trips to those wildlands, and I helped coordinate the review of those massive documents about each area. I was at both of the initial statewide meetings of Alaska conservationists as we tried to figure out what we wanted in the proposal. And I served on the advisory committee to the Joint Federal-State Land Use Planning Commission. I learned a lot. But then, in 1976, I went to work for the state of Alaska as a planner for the Department of Natural Resources. This was still in the early idealistic days of the Hammond administration, and initially it seemed to be okay with my bosses, several of whom are in the room, to continue my conservation activities. But with each passing year, that got harder and harder to do, especially in any visible way. And my job and my 2 small children limited my time. So the march to Anilka went on without me. By the time of the hearings in 1978, I decided it was not a good idea for me to testify. I was beginning a project as manager of a plan for state lands in the Haines area, and branding myself further as a conservationist was not in my interest. The D2 hearings were too public, and this was in the days before the internet and Google. So we took a family trip in the Wrangles instead, a combination hike and raft trip. I would be out of town and unable to attend the hearings. But some force, apparently, and I don't usually think this way, had other plans for me. The hike was aborted after 2 days because there was a river that was too high to cross. We returned to our raft and began the float trip. By the time we reached Chitina, the hearings in Anchorage were underway, but they weren't over. We decided to spend the rest of our vacation at our cabin in the Tahkeetnas, still safely 100 miles away from Anchorage. But that hearing kept nagging at me. By the time we arrived at our trailhead, I said to my husband, "You and the kids go ahead. It's the last day of the hearings. There won't be anyone there. No one will notice. I've got to go support this bill." I figured the people in Washington might notice, at least count, but not the people in Alaska. So I went, and I testified, and I became one of those who helped create a slim majority of support in the Alaska hearings, and no one noticed. But that's not the end of the story. My project in Haines, which initially seemed to be going pretty well, blew up after President Carter's withdrawals under the Antiquities Act. Many people in Haines seemed to be convinced that Glacier Bay was going to reach out and envelop them, swallow them up. People who had been willing to talk about at least a modest, some kind of modest wilderness designation subsequently refused to talk about even wildlife habitat because it had that dread word wild in it. And they decided to research the hearing record because they wanted to know who among their neighbors were their enemy. I don't know what they found out about their neighbors, but they found my testimony. To put it mildly, in the Alaskan environment following the D2 withdrawals, having testified in favor of the D2 bill did not help my credibility as a neutral facilitator of decisions about the future of state lands in Haines. I survived, and we did finish a land use plan for Haines that in the end was supported by the community and that laid the groundwork for later protective actions, thanks to the help of some very brave conservationists in Haines. And you had to be brave to be a conservationist in Haines in those days. And now, of course, I'm glad that I testified in favor of the D2 bill, but it wasn't easy. I have a few announcements before we go on to our speakers for this morning. Please remember to visit the exhibit hall in the Dillingham Katmai King Solomon rooms across the hall. If you have any questions, direct them to the registration desk out by the steps. This is a Green Star event. Recycling bins are available in the exhibit hall. And speaking of recycling, at the end of the conference, if you're interested in recycling your name tag, please drop them at the registration desk. I also want to remind you that the Anilka poster is for sale across the hall in the exhibit room. It's $25. It features beautiful photos by Kim Hecox and Robert Ketchum, and they are both here, and they are willing to sign these. Unfortunately, the ones signed by President Carter are already sold out. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Dennis Hayes. Dennis Hayes is president and CEO of the Bullitt Foundation, which is an important funder of the Alaska Conservation Foundation and other Alaska groups. He was national coordinator of the first Earth Day in 1970, an event often credited with launching the modern American environmental movement. During the Carter administration, he served as director of the National Renewable Energy Lab. In 1979, Dennis received the National Jefferson Medal for greatest public service by an individual under 35. Hayes has also received the John Muir Award from the Sierra Club and the highest honors awarded by the National Wildlife Federation, the Humane Society, and the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. Time magazine selected Hayes as one of the heroes of the planet, and the National Audubon Society included him in its list of the 100 environmental heroes of the 20th century. He has been profiled as Newsmaker of the Week by ABC News and as Today's Person in the News by the New York Times. Please welcome Dennis Hayes.
Thank you very much, Helen, for what is certainly the most fulsome introduction ever given to somebody whose sole job is to introduce somebody else. How many of you went to the concert last night? Fantastic. I did not. And I was made instantly aware this morning of the fact that that was two mistakes simultaneously. First, it was apparently just a knock-you-out-of-your-socks concert, 23 songs belted out with her usual enthusiasm and talent. The second mistake was that instead I went out drinking with old friends that I guess we all kind of still thought of ourselves as young friends. It reminded me of the fundamental truth that my mother frequently uttered, generally with reference to my father, that alcohol is God's way of making sure that the Irish don't take over the earth. Any case, if I blur my lines this morning, it will be because my eyes are blurred rather than, well, that's the first sort of example of not knowing how to completely. So my job this morning is actually, fortunately, extremely simple. I want to say a few words about Gaylord Nelson. I want to offer a bridge from the focus on politics to culture, and I want to, of course, introduce a man who needs no introduction, Richard Nelson. After Fran Ulmer's moving tribute yesterday, most of what I wanted to say about Gaylord is redundant, and so I'm instead going to just say a couple of words on a very personal level. He launched my career and fundamentally reoriented my life by doing something that is remarkably rare. He placed a complete act of faith in a 25-year-old kid who had approached him with the temerity to see if no one happened to be organizing Harvard or perhaps even Cambridge yet, whether I might get the charter to do that, and instead he offered me a chance to organize the United States. There's something to be said about this passing of the torch. And those of you who, like me, have spent most of your time in the audience here watching panels might have noticed that some fair number of the panels have roughly the same age grade characteristics as the Presidium of the Chinese People's Republic. And that's as it should be, because this is a conference that's looking back at enormously powerful achievements 25 years ago. But social movements almost invariably are powered by the young. I'm in the midst of reading some stuff now about the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King, when he was leading the bus boycotts in Montgomery, when he returned to his home in panic because it had been bombed into smithereens to see whether his wife and children had survived, was 26 years old. The anti-war movement was entirely fueled by people in their 20s. In fact, we frequently said, never trust anyone over 30. Perspective that I personally abandoned a few years ago. And it's incredibly important for the environmental movement as well to be passing this torch on. I had the great fortune before this began to meet with 15 or 20 of the young environmental leaders of Alaska. You have an incredibly talented, thoughtful, reflective, politically savvy, hard-hitting, knowledgeable team here. And we need to make sure that they get catapulted into positions. Now, politics to culture. There's a phenomenon that has happened in Alaska where in the early stages there were crucial roles for outsiders, from Bob Marshall to Ed Wayburn. In recent decades, certainly with Anilka, it was a partnership between strong, vibrant, domestic Alaskan, politically savvy organizers and national powers, organizations, the Jimmy Carters, the Cecil Andresses, that without them you could not have succeeded. There occasionally has been a sense of tension in some of those relationships, but the partnership is essential if you're going to be doing things that are really powerful for conservation. It's true not just here, it's true every place. If you're going to try to save the Everglades, you have to reach outside Florida. If you're going to work in South Utah, you've got to enlist others. To save the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest, our whole purpose was to nationalize the issue because we didn't have the political clout inside, the economic clout inside the region to succeed on our own. And Principal Congressman was a congressman from Indiana to save the ancient forests of the coastal areas in Washington and Oregon. But in this age of growing federalism, when you see, for example, in the United States, the climate change debate being dominated by governors and mayors, not by the national legislature, where more and more power is adhering in an almost irredentist fashion to the centrifugal forces of politics, where you see what happened to the Soviet Union happening in area after area around the world. It becomes critically important to have power located where the decisions are most going to be influencing it. And that's what's happened in Alaska. I mean, these fragile tendrils that existed as the beginnings of a movement 25, 30, 40 years ago are now increasingly fully developed. You've got political entities here now that have genuine clout. And it's critically important because this is another torch that's being passed from national organizations to Alaskans who increasingly are going to be taking full responsibility for preserving your own environment and have the clout, the sophistication now to do that. This is a little bit of a stretch, but there's an analogous shift going on in literature. Many of us were introduced to Alaska by Robert Service, John McPhee, Barry Lopez, absolutely brilliant writers, but their perspective has been that of outsiders. And now there's a generation of Alaskan writers emerging, a few of whom are increasingly recognized as great writers who merely happen to live in Alaska. Wally Stegner always resented being called a Western writer. He was a writer. He happened to focus upon the West. I don't think I've ever heard anyone refer to Saul Bellow as a Chicago writer, or Elmore Leonard as a Detroit writer, or Ann Tyler as a Baltimore writer. They are, and certainly including Wally Stegner, all great writers who use their deep knowledge of specific places to illustrate universal truths. In that same vein, Richard Nelson is not an Alaskan writer. He is a great writer who with astonishing grace uses his profound knowledge of this place to illuminate universal truths. I have to confess I don't know all of Richard's books, but the ones I do know, Shadow of the Hunter and The Island Within, which won the John Burroughs Medal, are classics, radiating understated brilliance and complete integrity. Why is that important? I mean, you understand why you have to build your domestic political institutions in an age of irredentism, but why is it important to have writers actually located on the scene, living on the scene, committed to the state? And interestingly, Richard Nelson himself describes in an essay the reasons for this, back when he was himself an outsider. He wrote, "The first time I hunted caribou inland with a group of Inupiaq men, I was told to head for a spot with a name meaning high place to look out over the land. But because I was unaccustomed to the flat, seemingly featureless sprawl of the tundra, the high place was completely invisible to me. Here was a vast terrain intimately known by my companions, carrying hundreds of names handed down through the generations, but all that they knew about it was invisible to an outsider like me." Well, now some decades later, Richard Nelson is a true insider, a person who is deeply committed to Alaska and uses his profound knowledge of this place to illuminate universal truths. Richard Nelson.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Grab this. Let's put that there. Wow, it's what an amazing day yesterday. What a privilege to be here in the company with so many people who have done so much for Alaska, who have such a commitment to protecting this incredible place that we're lucky enough to give our hearts to. I want to, isn't it something, there's a feeling in these gatherings about, I don't know how to describe it. It's not like other gatherings. It's something completely different. And I think it's because people who care deeply about the natural world, the environment, who care about their places, are working in service to something that's much greater and much more important than they are themselves. And consequently, people are not, I think, carried away with with themselves, but they're carried away with what it is that they're working for. And it gives us a sense of commonality and shared spirit that's a powerful thing that you felt from the very first minute yesterday. It's an extraordinary thing. We're incredibly lucky to be a part of it. And the acknowledgments have been wonderful to hear, and I want to make a few of my own. First of all, to Deborah Williams for the invitation to be here and for everything else. Of course, to the staff and the partners and all the supporters of ACF for bringing us together, for God's sake. Dennis said it so well, I don't want to try to repeat it. What we in Alaska would do without the help of all of the people from all of the other places who support us, I cannot imagine. You're so, so important to us. So a very special thank you to everybody who came here and who comes here from somewhere else. I want to acknowledge the D09 people whose homeland we are in today. I want to acknowledge personally the Alaska Native people, Koyukon, Gwich'in, and Inupiaq, who have been my teachers and guides and patient friends over the years. And of course, the ancestral Native Alaskan people who have lived on the land here for millennia and done so in such a way that Alaska remains one of the world's greatest wild places. Finally, it's important to express profound thanks to President Carter and to everybody who helped to make, I'm going to try to say this in one mouthful, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, good grief, happen. Who made that happen, and we've heard many expressions, but I want to say this, that perhaps no other single event in this nation's recent history is more in keeping with the traditions of Alaska's first peoples than this legislative act. I want to, before I go into the subject, I wonder if, I wanted to just give us a minute and a half to hear some sounds from around Alaska. For the ornithologically inclined, there was one sound in there that came from the wrong hemisphere. That's the sound of fairy penguins that share their nesting grounds with short-tailed shearwaters in Tasmania. And when I recorded a radio program about short-tailed shearwaters, there were a lot of fairy penguin sounds in there. Ken, the engineer who put this together, didn't know the difference between fairy penguins and short-tailed shearwaters, so the penguins got in there, but I kind of like that. Anyway, over the past couple of years, I've been traveling around mostly Alaska, occasionally other places, making programs about the wild environment for Alaska public radio stations. I've had a lot of amazing experiences. I keep telling myself, they call this work, I always call it plurk. It's the perfect combination of play and work. And I've had a lot of incredible experiences while recording in remote places. Before I talk a little bit about this, I got to say one thing. Kim, thanks for the vest, buddy. I had this suit coat that was given to me by Scott Nathan because he felt sorry for me because of the way I dressed. And then I was whining to Kim and Melanie about carrying a suit coat around, and they had the perfect solution. They mailed me this vest, which reminded me to say that my friend Mark Gorman gave me the tie. My mother, many years ago, she's long departed, gave me this shirt. These pants are from my favorite thrift store in Katoomba, New South Wales, Australia. And the Tevas, I just got them off eBay. $14. It's all about friendship and recycling, this thing we do. Anyway, I've had all these incredible experiences over the past few years, recording a radio program about 30 yards away from southeast Alaska, grizzly bear feeding on a whale carcass, chasing sperm whales around off the coast of southeast Alaska with whale biologist Jan Straley, sea lions leaping out of the water 5 feet away from my 8-foot-long kayak while I was recording a program about sea lions, and those wolves howling right when I started recording a program in Denali National Park about wolves. A lot of incredible things have happened, but perhaps the most extraordinary happened just about 4 days ago in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, following a great trip with Dave Mills to the gates of the Arctic National Park. I was in the Saddlerochet River Valley at the edge of the coastal plain in the Arctic Refuge, and got into a throng of caribou beyond anything I have ever seen. Tens upon tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of caribou from the porcupine caribou herd. Substantial part of an aggregation that Fish and Game biologists estimated at somewhere around 50,000 to 60,000 animals, a good portion of the about 120,000 animal herd. The color of the caribou, the dark bulls that were coming into summer coats, the very light gray kind of winter coat, the hair falling off in tufts, you find it clinging to the willows, the dark fur around the eyes, the dark muzzles, the dark legs, some of the animals, as I mentioned, coming into their summer coats, the little calves frolicking and running back and forth, beautiful images of that in the movie last evening. The bulls with their great arcing, dark, velvet-covered antlers. The grunting sounds of the herds when they would break into spontaneous, insuppressible running, and the grunting sounds of the animals going back and forth. And of course, that clicking of hooves, thousands of hooves. 4 per animal. It doesn't take very many to make a lot of hooves. Just learned from Jack Rekoff, sitting right here, how the clicking is made. We always heard it was the tendons or the bones. Jack says, no, he can explain it. It's the clicking of the hooves themselves. And the thundering and huffing of the herds as they ran across the tundra. This land, this rolling land, velvety green tundra, the ridges climbing up on the other side of the Saddlerochet River, climbing up to high ridges, bare ridges, the rocks, the mountains in the background, the great glaciers nested in the clefts at the high ridges of those mountains. And then away to the north, the mountains relaxing down onto the north slope, and out beyond that glimmer of flat land, you could see the shimmer of the Beaufort Sea, the ice on the Beaufort Sea. There is no way to begin describing the power of that vast wild land and the elation that I felt in the presence of those caribou. Well, this experience, at least for me, epitomizes the unparalleled natural qualities of Alaska. An experience like that, as you all know from your own, it's much more real and tangible than the ways that we often measure or generalize about Alaska's wildness. The statistics that we love to quote, I really like the things that Fran Ulmer did yesterday, although I've forgotten them by now, but then forgotten most everything else too. 586,000 square miles, we all know that, about a fifth the size of the entire lower 48 states. 6,640 miles of coastline measured point to point. If you do all the coves and crenellations, it gets way, way bigger than that. And of course, more than the entire continental U.S. Whenever I'm visiting Texas, I always say, it's so nice to be here in this little bitty state. That's an obnoxious thing to say. That's why they haven't invited me back. Probably lots of other reasons, too. 3 million lakes in Alaska. Who counts that? Those things. 3,000 rivers, 17 of the 20 highest mountain peaks in the United States. And, of course, there's Denali, the great mountain, 20,320 feet, the highest mountain on the continent. Thousands of glaciers. I've read all these different numbers. Some people say there's 5,000 glaciers. Some people say 100,000. That's a hell of a range. The one thing we know is it's less every year, and there are 2 larger than the state of Delaware. About 950,000 caribou, about 150,000 moose, 30,000 grizzlies, about 98% of the total population of grizzlies in the United States. That's one of the saddest statistics that you can quote regarding the lower 48. 30,000 bald eagles, about half of the world's population of bald eagles. And of course, one of the world's greatest nesting grounds for birds that come from every continent, like those short-tailed shearwaters from the southern hemisphere, from all over North America, from Mexico, Central America, South America, from Asia, from Europe, the little wheat ears that come from, where is it, all the way over in northern Africa, the Pacific Islands, of course, the plovers that I just got done seeing in the Arctic Refuge, from Australia, from the Antarctic. About 100 million seabirds here to nest and feed in the summertime. And then those incalculable numbers of ducks and swans and grebes and loons and all the rest. And the further millions of songbirds. In the summertime, Alaska erupting in a glorious cacophony of bird songs, as if the northern wild is singing to itself. Well, we could also measure then Alaska's wildness in other deeper terms, in increments of awe and freedom and mystery, of solitude, of peace, of spiritual revelation, of pure raging euphoria. Above all else, wildness, of course, is what Alaska is. It's the defining quality of this place. It's the heart and the essence of Alaska. How could anyone ever think of Alaska? How can you hear that brilliant, beautiful word without thinking first about wildness, of the seemingly limitless, impeccable glory of the Alaskan wild? But we got to remember this very important thing. The wildness of Alaska is, of course, not only a gift to us from nature, it's also a gift to us from the thousands of generations of people who have come here long before those of us who are here today. As I watched those caribou in the Saddle-Rochit Valley, I thought about the native hunters who have watched and followed the caribou in that valley for so many thousands of years. And I thought about the many ways that Alaska is known in native traditions, traditions that are born up out of the land itself. This knowledge, I always like to think about it and talk about it as the knowledge is embodied in the richness of languages, like the language of the Inupiaq people, whose homeland, of course, includes the Saddle-Rochit Valley, and the northern part of the Arctic Refuge. If Jane Thompson is here, thank you for straightening me out on the pronunciation. I asked her on the plane from Barter Island, from Kaktovik, how do you correctly pronounce Saddle-Rochit? So she told me, roaring engine of the plane. I think I got it right. Saddle-Rochit. Well, the landscape, of course, is known in all of its details in traditions like those of the Inupiaq people, and it's richly embroidered with names. Now, forgive me, those of you whose language I'm stumbling through for my pronunciation. Pingusuguruk. It means a little hill thrust up by the permafrost. Mitkuteliat, Arctic terns. Kayaksirvik, place where a kayak was lost. That's the name for Icy Cape on the north coast. Nanovik, polar bear place. Kilimitarvik, place to hunt ducks with ivory bolas, the traditional way of catching ducks. And other names like Kekek Tsugurug, Minlek Taravik, Anaktur, Pauk Torovik, and hundreds of others. I lived in the village of Wainwright, Ulurunik, its proper name, on the north coast, down the coast from barrow in the 1960s when I was just a kid, about like Dennis when he was working in Washington, D.C. I had an incredible job, I think the ultimate job, from the United States Air Force to learn from Inupiaq people how to stay alive on the Arctic ice. It only took us 400 years to get around to asking Native people to teach us something. Better late than never, I hope. So I had this amazing job and spent a year, the turning point of my life, certainly, as a student of Inupiaq people. There's a huge vocabulary in the Inupiaq language, as in all Alaskan Native languages, vocabulary for every part of the natural world. Iqalugruak, chum salmon. Sulukpaurak, grayling. Tulik, yellow-billed loon. Ignikautuk, great name for the Steller's eider. Achtlak, grizzly bear. Amarok, wolf. Sisuak, beluga. And specialized words like this. Nukavek, an old bull walrus. Nanoyalik, that's a mother polar bear with small cubs. There's another word if her cubs are big. Isunguachek is a young male bowhead whale. Well, people like the Inupiaq Eskimos have closely studied their surrounding environment and accumulated an intricate, sophisticated knowledge over the generation upon generation upon generation of closely watching everything around them. For example, I remember when Inupiaq people first told me the polar bear is left-handed. Keep that in mind always, because if a polar bear is coming at you, make sure you jump to its right side. It's a little slower on that side. You learn after a while living with people not to question things like that. And I remember then reading something that some biologist had written, and I don't remember the source, I'm sorry, that's saying it's interesting, polar bears appear to favor the left paw. I remember an old man named Ikak, the greatest hunter in the village of Wainwright, long departed from this world, telling me about how he saw a polar bear on the other side of an open lead, and he wanted that polar bear. So he took off his white parka cover so he would look dark, and he laid on the ice, and he imitated a seal sleeping on the ice. The polar bear saw him, slipped into the water, slipped up on his side of the lead, stalked him until it was close enough for the prey to become the predator, and he got that whale. That kind of knowledge, where a person can enter the mind of the animal that he's hunting, is the legacy that's inherent in Alaska's wild places. Well, the traditions of the neighboring people to Inupiaq, Eskimo people, Koyukon Indians, can open our eyes to another dimension of the Alaskan wild. I spent a few years in Koyukon villages of Huslia and Hughes and Allakaket and Alatna, learning about the natural world from those people. A land that's also lavishly embellished with names in the Koyukon language, names like Bitzich Kohonatlantin, which means where a caribou is lying on its belly. Dilbagats Unihu, where somebody grabbed a ptarmigan. Tzahtichtanatakontin, the name of Huslia, where a forest fire burned all the way along the ridge to the river. That's what that means. This is a hard name to pronounce, but I love it. Gohtlitotia, I always stumble on it. It means hill shaped like the nape of a snowshoe hare's neck. Well, for Koyukon people, there's a lot more to the natural world than what can be seen and touched and studied. Like the Inupiaq people, Koyukon Indian people are experts in all the sophisticated scientific and technical knowledge about their environment and how to live there. But elders teach a knowledge that comes from another realm. It's beyond the reach of our sciences. It's a kind of knowledge that can only be learned through the teachers of the Koyukon tradition. For Koyukon people, the world is filled with spirit and power and awareness. Everything in the world has a person attribute to it. It has something like a soul to it. So people move, as I remember an elder, Edwin Simon, saying, there's always something in the air that watches us. And so people are living in a place where they'll have names like this, Dotson Kokariodin, the place where the great raven flew along the length of a lake. The great raven, Dotson Sa, who created the world in a time called Kadons Idni, a distant time, a time beyond memory, a time when animals and humans transformed back and forth between one and the other, a time when humans and animals shared a common language. And so, interestingly and importantly, I think in those traditions, humans were created by an animal, a very, very different way of looking at the world than the one that's taught in the tradition that I learned growing up. A few examples. The loon, Dodzina. The loon has a power that is revealed by its beauty, its physical beauty of its plumage, and by its voice. There's a saying in the Koyukan language, Otsa dodzin ton rido bizni inithon. It means when a loon calls on a lake, it's a sound against which all other sounds are measured. It's the greatest sound a person can hear. The power of the porcupine. Every animal has its own kind of power. And I remember Stephen Atlas saying, my old man told me, because the power of the porcupine is to know the land. You know how porcupines wander around. And he said, my old man told me the whole of Alaska is just like something inside the palm of a porcupine's hand. That's the kind of power it has to know the land. It knows everything about the terrain. A few days ago, I watched two beautiful blonde grizzly bears walking along the edge of the Saddle-Rochit Valley. They were shambling along, digging roots, a female and her almost fully grown cub. And I thought about the grizzly bear, the animal whose power is so great, it's better if you don't speak its real name. So in the Koyukan language, when they speak English, they'll often say, they'll just refer to it as the big animal, or the big bear, or the brown thing, something like that. It has a kind of power that's called Biyigahulan. It means it has a real spirit, a very powerful spirit. Contrast that, not speaking the name of the grizzly bear, to the habit of calling it Grizz, which I think would seem like an excessive familiarity to call an animal by a nickname like that, an animal of such power. I remember Levine Williams, Koyukan elder, saying to me, every hair on a brown bear's hide has a life of its own. This is what the old people told me. Chief John and some of the old elders had told Levine, who was an elder himself at the time, every hair moves and vibrates by itself when somebody surprises the bear. So it can't keep still. It can't hold its temper, he said. It takes a few years for all that life to go out of a brown bear's hide, he told me. That's the kind of power it has. So that view, he also used to tell me about brown bears and black bears. He said, remember this. He said it to me I don't know how many times. The brown bear can outmind you. In other words, it knows more than you do. Remember that. This view of nature, of course, completely changes the role of humankind. We belong to a larger, encompassing community of life. Nature is far more powerful and significant than we are. Our role as humans is to show humility and respect and restraint toward everything in nature. Arrogance, disrespect, and overuse bring punishment from nature itself. So I have thought that those teachings are so profound and wise, though they're not my own. I think it's important to bring them into my life. I think it's important to talk about them. I think it's important for us to try to learn about that way of seeing the world and try to bring that, something of that, into our lives. And I think we are doing that. It's a totally different sense of what wildness is and what wildness means. The fundamental principle being reciprocity. Give back to the natural world in return for all that it has given you. And I think that's what we are all about here. Traditions like these, I think, help us to understand why so much of Alaska remains pristine on such a grand and spectacular and almost dreamlike scale. This way of thinking and believing and shaping relationships to the natural community is still, of course, a living reality in some of the preeminent wild places that were protected by the Alaska Lands Act. The Act also, of course, recognizes, as we heard many times yesterday, traditional subsistence in Alaska. And so this act helps to nurture and sustain the cultures that imbue these lands with sacredness. This is profoundly important. It keeps something vital and wise alive. Today, I think we newcomers are beginning to see the wisdom in traditional ways like those of the Koyukon people. We live at a really exciting moment when the insights of Western science and philosophy and religious thinking are converging onto the insights of native traditions like those of Koyukon people. Part of this process, scientific studies are opening our eyes to almost miraculous secrets and processes that are hidden in the world around us. And one example that always comes to mind is that of the island bears in the Tongass National Forest where I live. Many people are drawn to Alaska by the dream of seeing just once in their life a grizzly bear. On 3 large islands in southeast Alaska, Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichagof Islands, there's something even more extraordinary. Studies of the mitochondrial DNA of those bears have revealed that those brown bears, those grizzly bears, are profoundly different from all the other grizzly bears in North America, separated from other populations for many thousands of years, changed relatively little from the ancestral brown bears of Asia. And I like to think of them as a sort of ancestral bear, in keeping with what I remember several Tlingit elders have said to me. When a person goes out to fish or hunt, it's a good thing to say, "Pardon me, my grandfather, for trespassing on your land. I'm only here trying to make a living the same as you are. My grandfather," the ancestral bear, the kin, but the ancestor. And that, in fact, is what those bears are. And closely related in a way it's hard to represent. You know, it's up here on the tree of the branch to the polar bear. And so those bears are also closely related to the polar bear. So when you see one of those animals, the extraordinary science, the way that science has this brilliance of revealing to us things that we wouldn't know otherwise, now we know, we're seeing something. That there are all the brown bears, all the grizzly bears of North America. There are 2 kinds. One is these, all the grizzly bears of North America, and the other, the bears of Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichagof Island. Every time I see one now, I think, holy mackerel. As if you weren't already going to say that, but you get the idea. Anyway, luckily these bears live on public land. And so we have here in Alaska a last chance in America to avoid what happened to grizzly bears everywhere else in this country. There are 1,500 to 2,000 grizzly bears on Baranof Island where I live. That's more grizzly bears on that one island, 100 miles long and maybe 20 miles wide at the widest. More grizzly bears on that one island hidden in the coast of southeast Alaska than exist today in the entire lower 48 states, where it's estimated that once there were between 50,000 and 100,000 grizzly bears. What an incredible privilege we have to live in this place. But, of course, those bears, even here in the Tongass, face serious threats. Clear-cutting of about 1 million acres of land in southeastern Alaska, something like 4,500 miles of logging roads winding along the mountainsides and up the valleys. Every new road, every clear cut carves a hole in the world of those grizzly bears. It's one reason why the defense of roadless areas and the efforts to change the destructive industrial clear-cut logging in southeast Alaska are so vitally important. If we listen to people like the Koyukon, these bears are more than simply exceptional and fascinating biological organisms. They're a powerful spiritual presence moving through the forest. I'll skip that story. Listen, I just got to say one little thing about it. With one of our favorite conservationists in southeast Alaska, Don Muller, a a brown bear swam across right in front of Don and I in a skiff, and I remember that bear looking up at us in the skiff right in front of us. And I remember seeing the crescents of its eyes as it looked at us. And I thought, this is a thinking animal. And at this moment, the animal is thinking about us. All right. I told it. 5 minutes. Thank you, Deborah. The Tongass National Forest and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge are part of something absolutely remarkable. America's beautiful and diverse and spectacularly rich array of places that are designated as public lands. By far the largest portion, of course, is here in Alaska. These protected lands, I don't need to say to this group, are among the greatest wild places anywhere on Earth today. It's important to say it again and again and again. These are public lands. They're often called by people federal land, Park Service land, Forest Service land, as if they belong to some distant, nebulous, disembodied, disconnected entity. But in fact, they belong to every citizen of this country according to present American law. Even if you don't own anything else, you are a co-owner in these places. They are not, as Governor Hammond said yesterday, they are not locked up. Never let anybody get away with saying that. They are locked open. They're intensively used. Public land is like zoning. We zone lands in urban places. We zone lands other places too. And we say these areas are set aside for certain designated uses, and use them we do. Private land is the ultimate lockup, as you know. So shouldn't we constantly remind our neighbors that when any public land is taken away, it's like taking away a piece of your own backyard, and that adding to public lands is giving a gift to every one of us? Well, another gift of public lands is that we are all privileged and have the right and the responsibility to be involved in how they're managed. After 20 years of advocacy for the Tongass National Forest as part of the Sitka Conservation Society, I began to see that this work is intricately engaged with and dependent upon the process of democracy. That every meeting, every written comment, every day in court, every public testimony, every meeting with officials, every ballot initiative, every protest and act of advocacy is a manifestation of our freedom of speech to influence decisions, to affect policies, to educate voters. Above all else, to change the way our society behaves toward its environment and takes care of its heritage of lands. Conservation advocacy has opened my eyes to the immeasurable gift of democracy and its inherent rights and freedoms. We are coming to see that conservation is the ultimate form of patriotism, and that conservationists are patriots for the American land. And finally, that the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act is a crowning moment in the history of patriotic allegiance to the American land. This is a true legacy. It's a stunningly brilliant moment that was created not by changing anything, but by leaving everything unchanged. I think again of that massive migrating herd of caribou in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge just a few days ago. As I watched, I started thinking about Lewis and Clark and how those explorers in their journals talked about the abounding grizzly bears, the wolves, the antelope, the deer, the elk, and above all else, the buffalo that darkened the land from horizon to horizon. Since Lewis and Clark's time, the American plains have been completely transformed, piece by piece, ranches, roads, farms, towns, cities, industries. Place after place, grizzly bears, wolves, buffalo disappeared until they were gone everywhere, and with them, that once vast wildness also vanished. All this happened within a few human lifetimes. I read the journals of Lewis and Clark as if they were fiction. So completely altered is the world they experienced. But remarkably, such a world still exists here in Alaska. You can see it in those enormous herds of caribou, in the calves frolicking around their moms, in the blonde grizzlies digging roots in the tundra. Being there in the Arctic Refuge and gates of the Arctic National Park, I felt as if my eyes had been opened to the world as Lewis and Clark saw it 2 centuries ago. Here it was, caribou rather than buffalo, tundra rather than prairie, homeland of the Inupiat and Gwich'in rather than the Lakota and Shoshone, but it was the original, unaltered, untrammeled, undiminished, untamed world. I felt as if I were standing in the moment of creation itself. And if this is not the world as God or the great raven intended it, tell me what else it could possibly be. Okay, I'm going to finish. 1 minute. This is the big finish now. For generations beyond fathoming, ancestral native people made promises to the land that sustained their physical and spiritual lives. They made promises in gestures of humility and respect toward everything in nature, promises in their traditional conservation practices, promises in great ceremonial events and in whispered prayers, promises in ancient languages, Yupik, Inupiaq. I wanted to think of this word. Alutiq, Aleut, Iak, Tlingit, Dena'ina, Holikachuk, Tanana, Koyukan, Gwich'in. Promises that nurtured balance in the relationships between people and the surrounding world. And the Alaska Lands Act is an echo from those who lived here before us. It's a promise enshrined as one of the truly great American legislative achievements. The Alaska Lands Act is a promise that we have made to the shining lakes and the twisting rivers, to the mountains and valleys, to the inlets and fjords, to the mazy island archipelagos. It's a promise to the forests and the tundra, to the muskegs and meadows, to the stony massifs and the sprawling glaciers. It's a promise to the caribou and the grizzly bear. It's a promise to the wolf and the wolverine, to the doll sheep and the mountain goat, to the beaver and the snowshoe hare. It's a promise to the bald eagle and the great gray owl, to the sandhill crane, to the spectacled eider, to the raven who soars overhead, always talking and watching and listening. The Alaska National Lands Conservation Act is a promise we have made to the vast, endlessly mysterious, unfathomably beautiful Alaskan land itself. So while we celebrate the anniversary of that promise, I hope that all of us are going to commit ourselves, above all else, to honor and protect this immeasurably important promise. And in so doing, to protect one of the finest natural treasures left anywhere on earth, the gift of wild Alaska. Can we promise to pass this gift along to generations yet to come, as earlier and wiser generations have given it to us? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. For those of you that aren't jumping up to go get another cup of coffee, welcome. My name is Suzanne Fleek, and I am the new Global Warming Program Officer at Alaska Conservation Foundation. My job is to rally the troops, to meet the call to action that President Carter made so eloquently at lunch yesterday. I was born and raised in Alaska. I was in 7th grade when Anilka passed. And although I certainly heard a lot about D2 lands and about Anilka, As you can imagine, it was not one of my chief concerns as a 12-year-old. But the debate that was taking place across Alaska was also taking place in my own family. My mother was one of those who believed that it was a good thing that our nation was protecting these lands and the rights of the people who depend on them. My father was one of those who cried that Alaska was being locked up and that it would be inaccessible to Alaskans. Today, for the most part, they are in agreement. And, as usual, my mother was right. My parents raised 3 daughters who cared deeply about the lands, their wildness, and their bounty, and about the cultures that are protected by Anilka. And today, my sisters and I, our professions and our passions are all related to protecting this legacy. Anilka is a success. For my generation, the debate is over. For that reason, I want to thank all of you who were so inspiring to listen to yesterday, who as a community pushed through the passage of Anilka. On behalf of my generation, I want to say thank you. I also want to say thank you on behalf of my children's generation. After all, this is their legacy, and for those who come after them. As Richard just said, this was a promise that we made to our elders and to those who came before us, but it is also a promise that we have made to those who come after us. It is my pleasure today to introduce 2 women who are charged with protecting this legacy. It is their job to protect the lands and the people of our great state. Our first speaker, Lynn Scarlett, is currently the Deputy Secretary Designee of the U.S. Department of the Interior. For the past 4 years, Lynn has served as the Assistant Secretary of Policy Management and Budget, a division that I used to work in Washington. And in that capacity, she coordinates budget planning within the department and coordinates department-wide environmental policy initiatives to implement Secretary Norton's 4 C's vision of conservation through cooperation, communication, and consultation. On her watch, the Interior Department funding for cooperative conservation grants have increased 3-fold to over $300 million, and an additional $75 million is proposed for next year. Prior to joining the Bush administration, she was president of the Reason Foundation, a nonprofit current affairs and communications organization in California. In addition to overseeing the foundation, Lynn has also authored several publications on incentive-based environmental policies. And I hear that she was able to enjoy a wonderful trip through parts of Alaska yesterday and has more to look forward to today. So on behalf of Alaskans and everyone here in the room today, please help me welcome Lynn Scarlett.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I actually got to add 2 birds to my life list yesterday, so that was a real bargain during the trip. I am delighted to be here for this 25th anniversary commemoration of Anilka. As you all know, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act was at least a decade in the making. The act created a statutory context that holds forth the prospect of conservation alongside thriving communities, conservation that carves out continued opportunities for hunting and fishing and other human activities. Anilka's legacy is in part expressed through the tally of its vital statistics. The 44 million acres, a doubling of our national park system. The 53 million acres added to our National Wildlife Refuge System, also a doubling. All of you gathered here and this nation celebrate these grand, diverse wetlands, uplands, forests, coastal plains, mountains. But with this legacy also come continued challenges. Challenges that share some common denominators with management and conservation of lands and waters across America. Challenges that require consideration and conversation that transcends the din of debate. I want to mention 3 of these challenges. First is the delicate interface of people with places. How do we conserve these great, grand, special places while providing access and opportunity for Alaskans, indeed for Americans? How do we preserve the history of human touch, like Yukon River cabins or remnants of the Klondike Gold Rush, while providing access to visitors, while providing economic opportunity? That is the first challenge, addressing that delicate balance of people and place. The second challenge is the matter of complexity. As we manage these lands, how are they changing over time? What is their hydrology? How are sediments moving along coasts? How does melting ice affect polar bears? How does one change on the landscape interconnect and affect other natural phenomena? And that brings me to the third complexity, perhaps the most difficult of all, the complexity that springs from the variety of human hopes and values that become part of our decision-making equation. Folks want wild places for their intrinsic qualities and the wonder that they spark in us. Rural communities want to maintain and nurture their culture and pursue 21st century opportunities. Inhabitants within and around refuges, parks, and other natural settings want access to their homes, their neighbors, their communities, their towns. Recreation enthusiasts want to touch and traverse these grand spaces and places. Alaskans want opportunities to prosper and pursue their dreams, including access to natural resources. Americans want a prosperous nation. These 3 challenges recur and complicate decisions across the nation as we seek to conserve wildlife and wild places. Anilka's land legacy came through an act of Congress. But addressing these 3 challenges I have enumerated will require the engagement of communities. Achieving the promise of conservation combined with community well-being underscores the importance of what Secretary Norton refers to as cooperative conservation. Decision-making that springs from a context that nurtures partnerships and shared stewardship, that builds upon the insights and values of local folks, that taps local knowledge, the experiential knowledge of time, place, and situation. Poet Wallace Stevens once wrote that perhaps real truth depends upon a walk around the lake. What Stevens was referring to was both metaphoric and literally the knowledge that comes from living in, living on, and loving a place, knowing it in summer and in fall, in winter and in spring, in drought and in flooding. It refers to the sorts of insights that come from living in a community, living in a place, the sort of experiential knowledge that can give rise to unexpected problem solving. I met with our Fish and Wildlife Service, who told me that their research had indicated that certain fishing practices might be jeopardizing albatross. But rather than saying, "Thou shalt not fish," they sat down with the fishermen using their local knowledge, their experiential knowledge, their knowledge of their equipment, their practices, said, "Hark, we can do this differently." And the outcome, therefore, is the continuation of that fishing alongside the conservation and preservation of the albatross. These efforts that fulfill the promise of conservation alongside community opportunities spring from the art of conversation, the setting aside of habits of debate. They emerge from face-to-face dialogue, what author Walter Isaacs calls conversation with a center, not sides. The search for that sweet spot around which agreements can form. You all know that this is hard work. It requires the ability to listen. Walter Isaacs, again in his book, noted that to listen is to develop an inner silence. Think about it, to set aside preconceptions, prejudices, and foregone conclusions, and hear the values expressed by others. It requires a strong foundation of science to inform decisions, along with that experiential knowledge, that local knowledge of time, place, situation that resides in local folks in local places. It sometimes requires new methods of shared governance. In Arizona, at our Sonoyta Valley Planning Partnership, there was a decade of dispute around recreation, grazing, other land uses, across jurisdictions, multiple ownerships, until one day, and over many days, the folks in those communities sat down together. They sat down together and said, what is our vision for this land? And crafted a set of expectations and hoped for outcomes. To govern that effort through a special act of Congress, they created the Sonoyta Valley Planning Partnership Board of Directors to ensure that that vision will be accomplished. Or the Northwest Straits Marine Partnership off the coast of the Northwest, where multiple communities across multiple jurisdictions recognized that nature knows no jurisdictional boundaries, that the effort of one community to preserve and conserve and manage its coast must be interconnected with the efforts of the next community and the next. And so they formed a partnership and a shared governance with shared goals to work together across those boundaries in everything from marine debris pickup to sedimentation management. Durable conservation, in my mind, through this 21st century will above all require a foundation that secures community opportunities and dynamic economies alongside healthy lands and waters, wild places, and wildlife. This nation, our 50 states, our many communities, those of you gathered here in this room, are, I believe, just beginning to find the ways to shape that foundation. Let us see what the future holds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn. It was so good to hear you talk about both values and community, because I think everyone in this room also agrees that that is how we move forward to protect the Anilka legacy. We are also honored today to have Julie Kitka with us. Julie is well known and well respected throughout Alaska, and someone that I have respected personally for a long time. Julie is president of the Alaska Federation of Natives, a position that she has held for 15 years now, which alone speaks of her tenacity. At AFN, Julie serves the 13 regional ANCSA corporations, 12 regional nonprofit tribal associations, and 178 villages. Over that time, Julie has tirelessly fought to sustain rural communities and advocate on behalf of Alaska Native people. Since the beginning of her career, Julie has made it a personal goal to see Alaska Natives achieve their full potential in their cultural settings for their own future. Julie also serves as one of the commissioners on the congressionally formed Denali Commission, overseeing federal funding for rural infrastructure. Please help me in welcoming Julie Kitka.
Good morning. First of all, for those of you that are new to Alaska, welcome to Alaska. We're having another absolutely beautiful summer, and we hope you get out to the rural areas and to some of our communities and get to know some of our folks that are out busy hunting and gathering and fishing and putting up fish, and I hope you had a chance to taste some of this year's run. I'm honored to be invited to speak with you briefly this morning. I was trying to figure out what to talk about on that, but we have a couple top priorities that we're working on that I thought would be important to share with you. First of all, the Alaska Federation of Natives was formed in 1966, and our primary mission as an organization was to be a tool for the Native people in accomplishing our Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And that was accomplished in 1971, and one of the most massive land settlements in the United States history. We have been involved since then in every single Congress in amending the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, in trying to make it more responsive to meet the needs of the people. We view our Land Claims Settlement Act as a living document, a relationship between the Native people and the United States Congress. Where the connection with our land claims has to do with the NILCA, has to do with a number of things. Our hunting and fishing rights in particular, Title VIII of ANILCA, is the last remnants of our hunting and fishing rights that we are busy trying to obtain back for our Native people, and in that sense, Title VIII of ANILCA was vitally important to the survival of the Native people as we know them today. If there had not been Title VIII of ANILCA, I think that there would have been a huge erosion in the Native community, and even worse, social dynamics within our communities, as we would have been facing even greater competition for hunting and fishing from the larger majority. And so Title VIII, in that sense, absolutely was essential for the survival of the Native people. But it's important for the conservation community to realize that that is not enough to ensure the survival of the Native people. This week, we also are celebrating within the Native community the 35th anniversary of President Nixon's federal policy on self-determination. For Alaska Native people, that federal policy of self-determination is as important as our land claims settlement. The promise of the self-determination policy, which we believe has been the most effective, best federal policy in the history of our lifetime as far as affecting Native people, is the promise of freedom for our people. Freedom from the remnants of colonization, freedom from outside dictatorship, and empowering the Native people. And it is that 35th anniversary this year that we would like to invite you to join us in a renewed partnership in creating greater opportunities for the Native people, greater opportunities for the protection of public lands in the state, but not forgetting the people aspect of that. As I said, the self-determination policy is at the 35th anniversary. It is an opportune time for a whole new level of that self-determination policy, beyond where the United States deals with indigenous people in the United States, beyond the level of freedom that Native people have today. There is a lot of unfinished work that needs to be done with the Native community, from our leadership, from our regional levels, from our village levels, both corporations and tribal, to accomplish our aspirations. And our aspirations are to fully empower our people to live off the land and to stem the migration from our rural areas into the cities because of lack of opportunity in the economic realm. I have a bias for action. I don't like just talking, I like to get things done. And so I'd like to put out a couple challenges to you as far as a renewed partnership. We are embarking in a new initiative this year, what we're calling the Alaska Marketplace. And it is based off the World Bank's Development Marketplace in funding new innovative ideas that make a difference in practical people's everyday life. We are launching this year at the AFN convention, and our focus this year is going to be on culture and development. And that is like totally wide open for a partnership between all Alaskans, including you and your community, in strengthening culture and development and exploring new and better ideas in how you create economic opportunities, how you strengthen Native cultures, how you create opportunities for the next generation. And there is a next generation coming up. Our population projected to double every 23 years. And if you can imagine how many jobs that translates into for people to have the opportunity to provide for themselves as well as provide for their soon-to-be families, desperate need for creating economic opportunities for our people. This whole theme on culture and development is, like I said, one of the most exciting areas that we are putting time in, and that includes areas such as cultural tourism, expanding opportunities for Native in-home manufacturing of art and creating fair value for the artists in their home communities. We had a small mission that went out to one of our villages in the rural areas this past year to meet with the Native artists, and they had 90 Native artists show up at that meeting. They had no idea that there was that many people that were busy working on different crafts and world-class art being produced, but they are not getting a fair value for their market. They are being stopped with many different roadblocks in the way, and not the least is that not enough attention is being focused on how to empower them to get a fair value for that. So there's lots of areas of common areas for a renewed partnership, and this whole theme on culture and development, and how do you allow Native peoples to survive, but how do you allow them also to have economic opportunities to provide for their family, is, in my view, a very strong area of common ground that I would ask you to consider as you're designing your plans and your own bias for action, rather than just focus just only on the land and its purity and whatever, is keep in mind that there are people living on the land, and there's people that have aspirations for their future, and they aren't necessarily in conflict with you, but they want to be able to survive and maintain their traditions. And another area that we're working on, which I think is an area for tremendous common ground, and we hosted a leadership forum last summer, and we called that leadership Building Knowledge-Based Economies. And we brought together, we had two cabinet secretaries, the Secretary of Transportation and Secretary John Snow from Treasury. We had our congressional delegation. We had numerous partners on this. And we also feel that this is the wave of the future for our people in the state and for our people as a whole in Alaska, is moving towards knowledge-based economies. We are positioned in the world in a very unique time and place, and there is ways that we can capitalize on that, on the intellectual capabilities of our people, the genius of our own people, in ways that do not have negative impacts to our environment. And the whole area of knowledge-based economies is one way to do that. We are also launching several different other initiatives based on our work last summer on the knowledge-based economies, in which we are looking to try to get support on the congressional level. One in particular is a Native American Trade Commission. We are calling upon the historical roots of our own people as traders in the world, and trying to empower our own people to participate in the global economy as traders. One of the important aspects of that is it helps us break the dependency mode on government, the dependency mode that's our remnants of the colonization process and its deep roots affecting Native people, because you can't be a trader, you can't be involved in global trade issues through a Native American Trade Commission unless you produce something. And so we think that just from a very practical standpoint for our own people, as well as going back to our historical roots as being a trader, that's a very exciting opportunity. Another area in my bias for action, which I think is common ground, which also ties in with this knowledge-based economy movement and development, and as I said, I do think it is the wave of the future for our people, is this whole idea of trying to capture a regional educational lab here in Alaska. We need to be able to capture global best practices in education and training for our people. We need to have that opportunity. We shouldn't be accepting substandard educational outcomes from the systems, and getting a regional educational lab here in the state will help us build on global best practices on education and training. And I would ask for you, as you take a look at your bias for action and what you're trying to do, is help us get this regional lab for education. Again, it's an area of common ground. We have a lot of exciting initiatives that we're very excited about, and some of them are just little kernels of idea, but they are collecting strength day by day, community by community. We're getting ready to set up a microloan program, which we're also calling Global Best Practices in Microloan and Finance, because we see that there is a whole lot of people in our communities that just don't have the startup capital to get going on their things, whether or not it's bed and breakfasts, whether or not it is ecotourism, cultural tourism, whether or not it's exploring ways to share Native culture with other people in authentic, meaningful ways, that they just don't have the access to the capital on doing some of these things. And so we're exploring some of those different ideas. That's basically all I wanted to share today. I think it is a time for renewed discussions on relationships and common ground. I ask you not to forget the people aspect of that, not to forget that the people have their own aspirations for their own future, but there is much common ground to work together as Alaskans, and we wish you well as you celebrate the 25th anniversary. We are very grateful for Title VIII in Anilka. We do believe it needs to be strengthened, and we need to see greater opportunities for the Native people to be able to protect their own traditions and their livelihoods. And we expect that in the future there'll be opportunities for greater discussions on that as the opportunities on the congressional level open up or attention is focused on that. Whether or not attention is focused on that from court decisions that are made which create crises, or whether or not opportunities are created because of legislative initiatives that create crises. So with that, I would like to thank you for listening to me. I would respect if you disagree with any of the aspects that I share with you. That's not a problem, but wanted to give you an idea of some of the things that we're thinking about and working on, and wish you well in the rest of your conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have one additional exciting panel before the break, and so if the panelists for the testimonial panel can please come up. And while they're doing so, it gives us an opportunity to reflect on indeed how rich we are, to have the public lands that we have, to have the leadership that we have, to have the heroes that we have, and to have the young generation that we have. And while reflecting on that richness, don't forget, you can get your 25th anniversary of Anilka poster for a mere $25. Oh, it's upside down. And you can even mount it right. But one thing I want to add to this is you'll have a wonderful opportunity for the remainder of the conference not only to get the photographers to sign it, but also the heroes, young and old, that are here. This is a fabulous opportunity. All right. All right, now we are fortunate to have 4 people. We wanted to have testimonial snapshots from 3 different areas of Alaska, and from someone who cares deeply about Alaska but has the misfortune of living in the lower 48. And so to present a nice statewide perspective, we have 4 brief testimonials, and then we'll be taking our break. Our first testimonial is from Jack Rekoff, and each of the individuals will be self-introducing.
Thank you. I was invited down by Deborah, who sought me out in the Brooks Range to come down here and speak from a local perspective. I come from a village in the central Brooks Range, a small village named Wiseman. That's the village where the great conservationist Bob Marshall had spent 15 months in the late 1920s. I was born in this city of Anchorage in the territory of Alaska in 1957. Moving around Alaska, we first came to the Brooks Range in the early 1960s. My dad, Rick, was a hunter, trapper, and pilot. We always harvested and ate only wild meat, and I attended village schools with Athabascan and Eskimo kids, and sometimes homeschool. I was a kid when we would visit the old-timers, as there was no TV, and visiting was and is a big part of life in rural Alaska. We visited elders of both cultures for hours, talking about the lifeways before and just after the Western culture had come to the country. I was taken afield by my dad, starting at 18 months, hunting, fishing, and trapping. In the late 1960s, fur prices were low, so my dad began guiding a few non-resident hunts. We moved to Wiseman in 1971 from Chandalar Lake. During the construction of the Hall Road and pipeline in 1974, there were huge changes. They are only a mile across the river from us. We still hunted in fall, sometimes guiding and sometimes not. trapped in the winter and commercial fished in southwest Alaska in summer. We wanted nothing to do with the pipeline construction, as the people of Wiseman felt it would wreck the country with too many hunters. Protections for the land by the state north of the Yukon helped lessen the blow. I was a young adult when the conservation units were withdrawn in 1978 and ANILCA legislation was passed in 1980. Of course, sport hunting was to be eliminated from gates of the Arctic National Park, and Dad was upset. I was disenchanted with the sport hunters, but was concerned that the rumored subsistence uses would continue to be allowed. Without the harvest of wild, renewable resources, it would be impossible to pay the cost of replacing meat, wood, etc. with inferior products. These replacement costs are 100 to 400% over urban prices once shipped in. Other people of the area were also concerned. Would we be excluded from the traditional areas of the park, only 5 miles west? The majority of the first managers were shipped up from outside with the embedded idea that parks did not have consumptive use. I was not inclined to enter the political arena, but to protect our lifeways, I did. We had many contentious meetings as diminished use areas were proposed by the National Park Service. I read the ANILCA law and marked up the Title VIII subsistence section that applies to local people. I found the rumors to be true. Congress and the President had indeed made provision and protections for subsistence, personal and family consumption of wild renewable resources for food, shelter, and fuel, sharing and customary trade of furs, etc., by rural residents. There was language that provided for a meaningful role in management. I have used the ANILCA law to compel the agencies to continue customary and traditional use of the resource. In 1991, I was asked by the Gates Superintendent Roger Seglin if I would accept a seat on the Gates of the Arctic Subsistence Resource Commission. I was also asked in 1993 to sit on the newly formed Western Interior Regional Advisory Council of the Federal Subsistence Board. I'm currently vice chair of both. Over the past 25 years, I have found that once the managers and the users apply the ANILCA law, it works. The promises that the President and Congress made to protect the wilderness and rural subsistence use on federal lands and waters is being done by managers and the Federal Subsistence Board process. The National Park Service has accepted legitimate subsistence uses and listens to the Resource Commission members. Users have a meaningful role, as there are many meetings in rural Alaska to address concerns and have input on management. There are problems with any system, but nothing we cannot work out. The protection of the very valuable wild lands of Alaska by ANILCA are now especially appreciated by the people whose homelands are within or near conservation units. Healthy lands mean healthy resources for the people who rely on them. I volunteer many hundreds of hours yearly to advocate for the resource and users to assure continuance. I live near the Dalton Highway in the Central Brooks Range. When the Hall Road was built, measures by the state were taken to protect the wilderness tundra underlined by permafrost. Off-road vehicles were not allowed north of the Yukon by hunters to wander aimlessly as done to the central Alaskan areas. At great expense of time and limited funds, people of Wiseman Village, population 15, have fought Senate legislative bills to open this area to ORV use the past 2 sessions. If passed, the lands outside the conservation units will look like the devastated road-adjacent areas of southern Alaska. I would hope the majority of the legislatures will not throw out the promised protections of the land on a whim. Fortunately, most Alaskans and Americans do not hold to the myopic maximum use at any cost mindset. I am confident this bill that is stalled in the Senate will fail by the majority of the legislature once inspected under magnification. I have traveled here at my own expense to celebrate the passage of ANILCA on its 25th anniversary. In retrospect, it was the most telescopic piece of legislation since Seward talked Congress into buying Alaska. The vast beauty of this land is invaluable to the billions of future Americans who will enjoy them. I would hope to continue to advocate for this land and its people for at least another 25 years and come together with you for the celebration in 2030. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Darrell Schaefer-Meyer. I am nearly a lifelong resident of Seward, Alaska. I had the opportunity and privileged to be invited by Deborah to talk for a few minutes today about our experiences in our community of Seward with ANILCA and the positive changes that have occurred in Seward because of that relationship that has transpired over these 25 years. A little bit of background. I'm a graduate of the Ted Stevens School of Government, having worked for him for a few years in the early 1970s when much of the legislation that ultimately resulted in ANILCA was being put forth and sponsored, and there was a great variety of that. In fact, I had some experience with some of that when I worked in Washington, D.C. In 1977, I took a job with the city of Seward, and let me just describe for you a little bit about Seward in 1977. Seward, as many of you know, was devastated in the 1964 earthquake. The economy was nearly destroyed. Much of the industry that had been Seward's history and lifeblood was gone. The community struggled for many years following the earthquake to regain that economy. When I returned from Washington, D.C., and began employment with the city of Seward, things were tough indeed. We were experiencing near 30% unemployment in much of the year. There was virtually no tax base. People were saddled with a 25 mil property tax levy. There was a 2% sales tax that was helping support the school system through the borough. Things were difficult indeed. I was given the task of trying to identify lands that the city could acquire to help rejuvenate that lost economy. The early years of my employment was spent pursuing land selections in an area known as the 4th of July Creek. The city was an active participant in seeking such projects as Alpetco. How many of you have ever heard of that one? We had joined in a collaborative relationship with a Danish shipbuilding company called Burmeister Wain, who we married up with Vico. Some of you have heard of that. Unfortunately, that relationship dissolved, as did ultimately the relationship between the city and Vico. So 1977, 1978, we have then that period of time when the withdrawals were occurring, first by Secretary Andrus, then followed by that decision in December of 1978 by President Carter to withdraw and to create national monuments and other land preserves within Alaska. Included within that was the Kenai Fjords National Monument. Now, the residents of Seward were not particularly happy about that. I happened to be one of them because I was very involved trying to build the economy of Seward. There were great fears that that withdrawal was going to impact future decision-making and future opportunities for Seward. Well, we were wrong. I'm here to admit that. It took some education for us to realize that there were some economic blessings behind this national park. Now, let me tell you what some of those blessings have been. I was asked initially, well, what should the Park Service do to improve its relationships and its image within the community? I said, well, select a very special person to become the first superintendent. And don't have him wear that Smokey Bear uniform. Lose that thing for a while. Well, I'm happy to report they did. They selected Dave Moore. How many of you know Jason Moore?
Yeah.
That's Jason's dad. Dave was my neighbor during the years that he was in Seward. He did a masterful job of becoming part of that community, building that relationship. Dave later left and became superintendent of the Joshua Tree National Park in Lower 48. It was our loss. But he was replaced for a short time by a fellow by the name of Marvin Jensen, who too was very good. Marvin went on to become superintendent of Glacier Bay National Park. And then came a very special person, my dear friend and neighbor also, Ann Castellina. Ann was assigned to the park in about 1987, I believe, and she resided there until just recently, just about a year and a half ago now, and left and went back to Washington, D.C. But let me tell you about the work that was done. Ann was very special about becoming very much part of Seward. She made sure that her people were part of Seward, were involved in its boards, its commissions, its clubs, its groups, its very community. We had an oil spill in 1989. There was a remarkably good cooperation and collaboration that existed between the city of Seward, I don't know, I was a city manager during that time, and the National Park Service. We put together a response that was adopted with very little change by the responders to the oil spill, Exxon and its contractor Vico. We protected our resources as a community and as a collaboration between the Park Service and the city. We had goals that we were not going to let that experience change our community. We were not going to let it harm that beauty and that environment more than it already had been harmed by the spill because of the response. We were successful. Much credit goes to Ann's leadership in that regard. Now let me tell you just quickly, I know my time is expiring here, some of the results of that relationship and that experience that we've had in our community. Today, our property tax mill levy, combined borough and city, is 10.6 mills. We do have a 6% sales tax, 2% that still supports the school system. But let me tell you what the real statistic is, and that has to do with taxable sales. In the last 13 years, taxable sales have increased in the city of Seward nearly 50%. It's almost 3.6% a year. Now that is a record that's not equaled by any other community within the Kenai Peninsula Borough. Much of that can be tied statistically to two things: growth in retail and service sales. What are those retail and service sales attributed to? That is the visitor industry in Seward. Why do people come to Seward? They come to Seward in large part to visit Kenai Fjords National Park. It is a wonderful park. It is accessible to all Americans, and it is a beautiful place. I leave that with you. I'm a strong advocate of that park. I love that park, and I'm grateful for all the supporters that have been there to improve upon it and see it grow. Much work remains. It's not going to be static. There are issues to still be resolved. Park Service is working diligently to create a multi-agency headquarters in downtown Seward, something very strongly supported by the citizens and residents of that community. We hope that that succeeds, and we look for great things here on out into the future. I appreciate this opportunity. Come to Seward, come visit the Alaska Sea Life Center where I work. If you haven't done so, it's a wonderful place. I'm doing some great research there, and it's a beautiful place just to see the animals. Thank you.
Good morning. Before I get started, let's get up and stretch a little bit. Stretch your legs, and I want you to understand what I'm going to be talking about this morning. That feels good. I'm just like Anilka, huh? You may be seated. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Mike Williams. I'm the son of late Tim Williams, and my mom is Helena Williams, who is currently an elder and my great advisor, and my uncle Joe Lomack is the traditional chief of the Yupak people in Western Alaska, and I've been involved briefly trying to get the awareness and legal status, rights, and authorities of our 231 federally recognized tribes in Alaska. And I've been trying to educate both within the Native community as well as the outside of the Native community. And I've been serving on my tribal council for over 20 years, and currently I'm serving as chairman for the Association of Village Council Presidents, and also served on serving on the executive board with the National Congress of American Indians. And right now, I'm also the president of the Rural Alaska Community Action Program, and I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Jonathan Solomon from Fort Yukon, which has been my advisor and I've learned a lot from Jonathan over the years that we've been on the board, and I really appreciate your intellectual capacity and your concern for the future of our people here in Alaska, as well as Andy Abona, if you're here. Andy is another board member from Rural Cap that consistently attends meetings. And I'd like to thank him for his efforts as well. I want to introduce David Hardenberg, which works with us, and David is doing a wonderful job with the capable help of Shauna Hegena, of course. Shauna is a young Alutiiq woman from down in the Aleut country, and like to thank them for their help. And I'd like to, first of all, thank Deborah, my sister, for inviting me to speak to you for 10 minutes this morning. And I like to share my perspectives as UPAC and fellow conservationist, why I believe Anilka's passage has benefited Alaska's tribes. I want to start by sharing a favorite story because it was first told at a memorial gathering to honor the late Congressman Morris Udall in January 1999 in his home city of Tucson, Arizona. N. Scott Momaday, a member of the Pawnee Nation, a professor of Native American literature, and a well-known poet in his own right, told this story at the start of his remembrances of Mo Udall because he felt the story naturally comported with Udall's unique and sharp sense of humor. Momaday said he was invited once to speak to a class of 6th graders in California, and that he somewhat reluctantly accepted because he could never feel sure that children of that age had a capacity to appreciate the more ironic twists inherent to Native American lore. He added, quote, "And I didn't know if they would grasp how old our Native American cultures actually are, predating as they do the very founding of the United States as a nation. In an effort to help them understand that our Indian nations have existed within America for literally thousands of years, I decided to start my story in a traditional Pawnee way. That is, I began by saying, this story took place in the days when dogs could talk. And there was this little girl in blonde pigtails sitting in the very front row with her chin in her fist. And when I said, this story is so old that it took place in the days when the dogs could talk, she released her chin from her fist, put forth a big sigh, and grinned. Those were the days, she said. I first heard the acronym ANILCA, probably in the middle of 70s. My memory is given out on me, but when I returned to Alaska after serving in the U.S. Army, but it took a while for me to recognize the significance of ANILCA to our Alaska Native villages, and especially what Title VIII of ANILCA could and would do to protect our subsistence way of life. At some point I learned, for example, that the regional for-profit corporation for our region, Chalista, was in the process of spending what ultimately would total in the neighborhood of $4 million, all to ensure that the people of our region could have a voice in the legislative process that led to ANILCA's passage. And I know that for all Native corporations who had all existed for a relatively short period of time by then, were unified in their determination that the act, as comprehensive and far-ranging as ANILCA, would address our desire to ensure that our ancient hunting, fishing, and gathering cultures would be protected somewhere within this new law. From a distance of 25 years, it all seems inevitable that Congress would support and pass what is now Title VIII of ANILCA. From a distance of 25 years, Title VIII is at times seemingly characterized as a sort of slam dunk. From a distance of 25 years, given the great strides that our Native people have made economically, socially, and politically, it seems incredible that there are actually people who opposed the inclusion of Title VIII. But for me personally, and for thousands and thousands of Alaska Natives who continue to support families and entire communities from the land and waters near our villages, the reality is all too clear. The reality is that we had to overcome geographic, cultural, political distances within the statewide Alaska Native community in order to unify our voices to Congress. In that way, we have succeeded in protecting the legal integrity of the Title VIII's existing protections for subsistence. Having said that, I want to be clear that our subsistence-reliant communities owe a huge debt of gratitude to you all. To those individuals and organizations who constitute the Alaskan and National Conservation and Environmental community, because I am convinced that many of our past goals would have suffered had we not been able to lay aside differences in the interest of achieving those goals. And I am convinced that for both the Alaskan tribal community and the Alaskan and National Conservation community, there are many future goals that will suffer defeat if we do not able to come together again with a single-minded determination to achieve those goals. Most notably, to work together starting right now. To do what we can to address the alarming impacts that climate change and global warming are having in Alaska. Title VIII of ANILCA has helped me and thousands like me to provide for my family. I believe large Alaska's tribal leaders have respect for what you do as conservationists, because there is recognition that without a clean environment, the fish, game, and everything we use for subsistence will not be safe to put on our tables. Our elders constantly tell us that we need to keep the air, the water, and the ground clean so that we can continue to live off the resources we have used for thousands of years without having to be scared that we will be somehow poisoned by our consumption of them. And I just wanted to thank Richard for his words this morning, and I learned a lot from him. And those words from the Inupiaq and from those other tribal communities have inspired me. And I think you too can learn the languages and our way of life that we have held for thousands of years. In conclusion, there's one issue that I want to ensure that the conservation community understands, and that is that there is and are differences between Alaskan Native corporations and Alaskan tribes and their governments. There is a huge difference. Too many times still, some 35 years after the passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, too many times we still hear from the non-natives that they are unaware of these differences. And I was encountered yesterday. I didn't know that. I didn't know there was differences, but there are. And I think we need to continually educate ourselves about those statuses. And Bob Anderson, if you missed the legal section yesterday, put it real clear about those differences. Again, I'd like to thank you once again. I have enjoyed being here with all of you in these past couple of days, celebrating the 25th anniversary of this great legislation, this great thing that we have heard since yesterday. So I'd like to really continue for the next 1,000 years to help protect our way of life and our lands and our resources, and to keep Alaska what it is. And I know that there are many interests, and those interests are drooling over our resources. And we should be mindful of that, and once again, we need to continue to work together to conserve our lands and our resources for our future generations. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Barron. I go by other names too, T.A. Barron when I'm a writer as opposed to a human being, or also Dad, or more frequently, Hey Dad, when I'm taking my kids on a trip to Alaska, which I do often. For you see, I'm not a hero of the Alaska Lands Act like many of you out here are, and it's been a privilege to be with you this week. Nor am I a subsistence hunter and fisher like Mike, nor even a full-time resident of the state. I am just someone who loves this place dearly and has been here more than 30 times in the last 30 years, often with my family. So I guess maybe the name that applies to me best of all is, you could call me a contributing member of the Alaska economy. And if you saw how much my 5 kids can eat, you would agree. We have had such amazing times here together and individually. Times of inspiration. I think of a visit to some Gwich'in friends and the honor to visit Jonathan Solomon's fish camp. Humorous times. I think of after a summer here in Alaska when my kids had a raging debate over which outhouse had the best view. A debate that lasted about 2 weeks on its own. If you want to know who won, I'll let you know in private later on. And then, frankly, very, very thoughtful times that have changed me forever. I just to think of only one. I think of a early morning on a lake, very quiet, when my then 5-year-old daughter, whose name is Denali, and I had the chance to hear a loon. That sound, as Richard said so beautifully, against which all other sounds must be compared. A sound that seems to come not just across space over the water, but across time from some eons ago moment. And I remember after we listened and the sound finally faded away, she said, "Daddy, why does that sound make me feel sad?" And I thought about it for a moment and said, well, maybe not sad exactly, maybe more like longing. Maybe it's because the call of the loon reminds us of a time when all of us, all the people and all the animals spoke the same language, when all of us could be friends. And she listened with those bright 5-year-old eyes and she said, "Daddy, I want to be the loon's friend again." So why do I keep coming back? Just look at what Anilka accomplished and you'll see why. For we have protected, to use Jimmy Carter's word, a miracle. It is a miracle, this place, a miracle of land, of people, and of the Spirit. And in these dark times in which we live, those are all rays of light. Let me briefly explain. The land is a ray of light. Radiating from those arboreal castles of Sitka spruce in southeast to the majestic sweeps of the Arctic coast, from the peaks lit by alpenglow to the braided rivers that flow down from them like the veins from a beating heart, rivers that embrace the salmon, support the caribou, and feed the eagle. The land of Alaska literally shines. And it is big, very big, big enough to illuminate and inspire all of us for all time. The people here are a kind of light. Really, a whole wondrous rainbow of colors and customs, traditions and songs, work and wisdom. And then the spiritual qualities of this place, they too are a kind of light. There is no way possible to place a monetary value on this kind of inspiration, which is why those who want to devour and destroy this place for profit, who see in Alaska merely oil barrels and board feet, are utterly blind. For the sacred place we call Alaska cannot be valued in money or oil or gold, but only in the enduring currency of the soul. So much light, so much light in land, in people, and in spirit. It makes you feel grateful just to be here for a short while, let alone to spend one's life or a big portion of one's life here. So, in conclusion, a dark time it is, my friends, but there is still Alaska, the place with the most to save and the most to lose of anywhere on earth. What greater place, really, I ask you, what greater place, what greater cause could we possibly find in our lives? A place where we can be the loon's friend again. That is why we must and have, I think, in this wonderful week, rededicate ourselves to saving it, so that throughout all time and all generations to come, people can say, there is still Alaska. There is still light. Thank you. You do that. Thank you.
That was a... Woo! Okay, now we get to get some exercise. Think about the magnificently brilliant, inspired comments today as we walk to the Egan Center. Okay, the concurrent sessions. We have one last group of concurrent sessions at the Egan Center. They're in the basement. So go to the basement, but then be back here by noon because we have the grand finale for this conference at lunch. So we'll see you all here at noon. Thank you so much. Please take everything you have with you because they'll be cleaning this up for lunch.
I'll see you in a couple of weeks.